Okay, Assalamu alaikum. We're going to do a different format today slightly. Inshallah, what we will do is we'll do a verse at a time, and we'll stop after each verse, look at the Arabic, look at the key lessons, and look at some of the themes. But before we do that, I want to put it into a little story format today, just to set the scene. And I want you to imagine there's a place called Islamville, okay, a little village, a little town somewhere, and in this town there's lots of problems. Okay, imagine there's people fighting, the orphans aren't being looked after, the widows, the poor people are getting a bad deal, all the religious people are just arguing with each other, and so on. And so what happens is the king of this area sends a wise man to this place. So the wise man comes along and he says, okay, I'm going to solve your problems for you. And he gives them a couple of principles. So I'm going to give you some core principles, a couple of things. If you follow this, then there won't be violence in your society, there won't be unfairness, any injustice. You will prosper, you'll do really well, you'll do economically really well, socially your societies will be cohesive. And he writes these rules down for them. And he summarizes these rules down into one key point. And that main point is worship God and serve His people. And then he breaks that down into small things, into a bit more detail, and he leaves them. Then a group of people in that town, they take the message, they look at it, and then they start applying it, and everything's fine. Things are working really well. And then after about 15-20 years, another group of people come along, and they start interpreting, and they say, well, and they start going into more and more detail. And as time passes by, there's a lot of commentary, there's a lot of interpretation, a lot of detail around the original message. But society is still breaking up. Everything's crumbling again. People are fighting, there's injustice, unfairness, and yet they all believe they're following the message. Okay, that's a little parable I've kind of made up, but when we read the verses, keep that in mind, because these verses are talking about a very, very similar situation, about God sending His message and how that message gets corrupted over time. But the people who are the gatekeepers of that message believe they are following the original message. Yet that message isn't leading to any benefits for society. Okay? But those people believe they are following the word of God. And this is the context of the verses that we're going to talk about today. There's a couple of themes that are going to come out, which we'll have a look at. These are some of the themes. Okay, so the parable of small Islamville. And although the example is made up, the general concept of revelation applies, because people were fighting, there was hatred in society, everybody was killing each other, and everybody said, I'm right. So how do you resolve those issues? Okay, because human beings will never agree. They will always say, my word, your word, his word. You need an external benchmark, a criteria that will say, actually, okay, we can all agree. If it comes from a non-human source, we can agree. Yep, and that's the most important point. There was a French philosopher once, and he said, if we had this external benchmark criteria, all humanity had, there would be no problems. The reason why you have problems is because human beings will never be able to agree on who's right. They will always think that they are right. So that criteria has to come. So God set this criteria. But our problem now is that although we've got this criteria, but it's been overlain by commentaries and explanations and so on, we've lost the core of the message. In these verses, God is addressing the people of the book, namely the Jews, and He's talking to them. And some of the issues that come out is, I'll put the second bullet point there, how do you ID check those claiming to have the truth. So somebody comes to you, knocks on your door, says, okay, right, I'm a representative of British Gas, for example. Yeah, I'm going to come and check. How do you ID that person? You look at his badge and so on and so on. If somebody comes to you and says, okay, I've come from God, right, how do you ID that person? How do you check the credentials of that person? And this is a very important point, because when the prophets came, they said the same thing. They went to the Jews, the Christians, and they said, we've come from God. And they said, where's your ID? Yeah? How do we know? Where is your proof that you're from God? And so these verses talk about how do you establish the credibility of the person who's claiming to come from God. And this also applies to us today. If somebody says, okay, I'm giving you God's message here, and the interesting thing is everybody says that they're giving you God's message. You know, you talk to every group and they will say, we're following God's message. Next group, we're following God's message as well. So we're not going to follow you. If they're all following God's message and it's all different, which is God's message? You know, this is a paradox. And that's the catch-22 of the religious groups. If everybody's claiming that what we have is from God, our interpretation is absolutely true, if each person insists on that, then we've got a huge problem. Who is on the truth and how do we decide that? So this set of verses deals with that issue of how do you decide in terms of religious groups, what is the criteria that you use to establish that. And there's a couple of more themes that come from these verses. Claims versus reality. Sometimes we claim, okay, we're following a religion, we will dress the part, we will follow the rituals, but then the reality is different. So there's one thing we say about how wonderful the religion is, but then our actions are totally different. So claims versus reality. And we find this, you know, if you look at Muslims, you know, we say Islam is the best solution for the entire world, and yet Muslims are in problems. You know, how does that fit in? But then we say, okay, don't look at the Muslims, look at the message, right? We always say that. Look at, and there's a very famous quote I remember from George Bernard Shaw, and he travelled all the Muslim world, and he came back and he said, you know, he says, I've come to the conclusion that Islam is the best religion but has the worst followers. And this is the same point that these verses make here, that we claim one thing, it's addressing the Jews, but actually the message applies to everybody. They are claiming that they are following the original message that came to Islamville, the original message that came, and yet their actions don't match. Okay? The reality of their society, the reality of their families is something totally different. It doesn't actually match. So how can you claim this and then do something opposite? And then that leads to the next thing, the litmus test of faith. How do you decide if somebody is on the true path or not? What is that litmus test? And we will discover that in these verses today. And then the verses talk about the golden calf. And we all know the story of the golden calf, where the Prophet Musa alayhi salam went to meet God on the mountain of Tur, and in his absence they created a golden calf from all the jewelry, all the ornaments, and they started worshipping the golden calf. Now the interesting thing is that the golden calf, they started worshipping the golden calf in the presence. The messenger was there. The messenger had explained all the clear signs. So despite all the clear signs, they followed the calf. So Allah gives us a warning here, that just because you have the truth, and just because you have the messenger, it doesn't mean that you're on the truth path. Okay? And that's a very important message for us, because sometimes we believe we've got the truth, the bayinat, the clear signs, and we think we're on the clear path. And Allah is addressing the Bani Israel because they've gone through the same journey as the Muslims are going through. And there's a hadith of the Prophet ﷺ, and the Prophet ﷺ said, you will follow the path of Ahl Kitab step by step. And and even if they go into a lizard's hole, you will follow them. And our journey has been very similar. If you compare the development of Judaism and Christianity from the starting point and the development of the very elaborate fiqh and so on, our journey is very, very similar. So we can learn lessons from the Jewish and Christian messages, the message that's given to them here as well. And then there's a verse that talks about the tongue and the hand, okay, the difference between speech and action. Okay, so you say one thing, you say we hear and we obey, but your actions are saying we disobey. And you disobey the core principles, the core contract that was made with God. And the last message that comes from this group of verses is where people have this idea of how pious they are themselves, how self-righteous they are. So they believe we are the holiest people around, nobody else is more holy than us. And they develop this concept of themselves that we are very religious, we're very pious, and to maintain this, they do certain things. And then Allah poses a direct question to them here. If that's the case, and you claim to believe in the akhirah, in the next life, then why are your actions linked to this dunya only? If you claim to believe in the akhirah, so if somebody's accepted that this life is temporary, we're here for a short period of time, this is a test, nobody's going to stay forever, and then you start focusing on building empires, on building wealth and capital and so on, without any regard for the akhirah, then there's a mismatch. And then yet you claim that you're very pious, you're very religious, but all your actions, all your efforts are geared towards the dunya. Okay, that's a summary overview of what we're going to be looking at. We'll take a verse at a time now, inshallah. And okay. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم ولما جاءهم كتاب من عند الله مصدق لما معهم وكانوا من قبل يستفتحون على الذين كفروا فلما جاءهم ما عرفوا كفروا به فلعنة الله على الكافرين. Okay, this is the first verse in this set. So when the book has come to them from God, وَلَمَّا جَاءَهُمْ كِتَابٌ مِّنْ عِنْدِ اللَّهِ, confirming what was with them. And even before this, they used to ask for victory against those who disbelieved. And when it comes to them and they recognize it, they reject it. And then the curse of God be on those who reject. So let's go back to the scenario I started. So you've got the king sends a messenger, the messenger leaves his guidance, and then over time the king will send people to make sure that the people are still on track, that the message hasn't been lost. So what's happened is, the message has been there, now the king sends one of his wise men after 30-40 years just to see that everybody's right. When they go there, the people say, no, we're not going to believe you, we're not going to accept what you're saying. And even though everything that they've got, it's confirming what's with them. Now, let me put this a different way. When the Prophet ﷺ brought the message, there were certain things that were different. Okay, the way we prayed is different, certain rituals were different. So they could argue that actually, what does God mean when He says something that confirmed what they already had? Their fiqh was very different, their rituals were very different. So what was it that the message of Muhammad ﷺ was confirming what they already had? And the message wasn't the outward aspect, but it was the core values of religion. It was those basic things that we talked about in the previous verses, about worshipping God, being kind to the orphans, the needy in society, and it confirms that. So God gives them a criteria, but the criteria is, if somebody is calling towards God, not wanting any compensation or any reward for this, if somebody's claiming that and inviting you to do good for society, good for orphans, good for widows, you've got some principles there. You check with your criteria, sheet of criteria, and say, okay, right, is this confirming what we've got? Now, but the problem is, what happened is, they started looking at the outward things. So, for example, they said, well, now the Qibla, for example, you're worshipping, you're praying towards a different Qibla. Even though that's the outward aspect, but the inner aspect is that you're still worshipping God. Now, imagine that the wise man, when he sent his message, he said, okay, I want you to worship God, I want you to stand up, I want you to bow, I want you to prostrate. Then the later commentators came along, they said, okay, well, when you pray, you should put your hands here. And somebody said, no, you've got to put them here. Somebody said, no, you've got to do this, Rafa Yadayn. Somebody, oh, no, you've got to put your fingers here and there. And they became so much detail, they forgot the purpose of the prayer. And this is what happened with the message of God, where God sends the message, but over time, the religiosity overcomes that, and you forget the core message. So the whole purpose of prayer is lost. And you can see this in the Jewish religion. They have so many complicated rules for worship. Very, very complicated. They are not even allowed to touch the holy book without a special stick or a yad. Yeah, they can't even touch it. They've made all these rules and all these rituals, and yet the whole point of worship has got lost. Now, I don't want to make too many comparisons with Islamic fiqh, but in a way we've done the same. Our fiqh books are so focused on the outward aspects of prayer that we argue whether we should put the hands here or hands there, whether we should do Rafa Yadayn or not. But the point of remembering God has been lost. Okay. So when it says confirming what you have, it's not confirming the rituals, it's confirming the core principles. And this goes back to, how do you establish the ID? How do you know? The criteria are the core principles. If the message that the new person is bringing agrees with the core criteria, then you have to accept that. Okay? That's your benchmark. Not that they have to do exactly what we do, but it's the core principles behind that. The other interesting thing here is that says وَكَانُوا مِن قَبْلُ يَسْتَفْتِحُونَ عَلَى الَّذِينَ كَفَرُوا. That before the Prophet ﷺ came, the Torah and the Injil, they gave certain prophecies. They said, okay, a messenger is going to come and he's going to bring peace in the world. And those of you interested, there are lots of scholars have done lots and lots of research to prove the prophecies in the Quran, in the Bible, and the Injil and the Torah, they are referring to the Prophet. There's many, many examples. So the Jews, they used to say to the pagan Arabs, when they were fighting with them, that you shouldn't all fight with us, because God's going to send a messenger and he's going to overpower all of you, and we will win and we will be victorious, because our books tell us this. So they used to say this all the time. Now when the messenger came, they should have been happy, because the messenger did them a favor. It proved and verified that their scripture was correct. Their prophecies were proven to be true. So they should have celebrated, saying, look, our books are true, because this was the prophecy, and look, it's happened, it's completed. But they didn't. They didn't do that. Why? Why didn't they do that? Because they felt that they alone had the message. That piece of paper I talked about, they said, well, it doesn't agree with all our commentaries on the Torah. What he's saying doesn't agree with all of this. We're not going to worship or accept his ways, because it doesn't agree in the details of the Torah. So they were missing the point. And this is very similar to what we've got today, sectarianism. Every group has certain things. Yeah, they say, okay, this is what we believe, and we believe this is from God. Everybody will say to you, this is from God. And if everybody insists on that, there is no way that these groups will ever come together. Absolutely impossible. Okay. But Allah gives us a solution in these verses. He says, you set up a criteria, مُصَدِّقٌ لِمَا مَعَهُمْ, confirming what is with them. So what do we have? Everybody has the Quran and everybody has the Sunnah. In those are core principles. The contract that we talked about in the previous verses, that is the core of the religion. If that is our benchmark and your sect or group is promoting that, anything that goes against that, that's divisive, we reject that. Anything that confirms it, we accept that. So this is the beautiful point, that the Quran affirms that the Torah, the Bible, and the Injil, the Old Testament and the New Testament, are the Word of God. It confirms that. However, what it also tells us is that these messages have been corrupted and the essence of this message has been ignored. We've lost the way. We've become stuck in all the rituals, and we've forgotten actually, despite so much religion, have we still got injustices in our society? Well, religion should have dealt with that. Have we got equality? Have we got fairness? Is society cohesive? Is the economy prospering? Because God promises that if you follow His message, He will open up the skies for you. He will give you from ways where you hadn't even imagined. So the question to ask then, this is the basic test. If we are following the core principles of religion, why isn't our society improving? Okay? And you may say, okay, in England that doesn't apply. But even in England, within our communities, we should see prosperity and cohesiveness. But let's apply in the Muslim world. Why is there still injustice? And this, for me, it goes back to the same point. We have steered away from the core principles and values of religion, and we've moved towards all the rituals. Yeah. And in this verse, it says, when it came to them, they recognized it. In another part of the Quran, it says they recognize the Prophet as they recognize their own children. Right? So clearly, they recognize the Prophet as they recognize their own children. Yet, despite this, they rejected it. Okay? So they knew it's true. They knew that the source that their message has come from, their books, and the source of this new message is the same, and yet they still rejected it. And the consequence of this, and these are very strong words. Allah is using very, very strong words here. فَلَعْنَةُ اللَّهِ عَلَى الْكَافِرِينَ. Extremely, extremely strong words are used for the person who knows what the message really is and yet insists to follow his own opinion still. Right? And the word here for la'na, what it means is that you're cast out from God's mercy. You will have no blessing in your life, in your societies. Absolutely none at all. And kafir here doesn't mean that you're worshipping other gods. Here it means rejection, that you're rejecting the essence, the core of the message. So one last point on there. So I know it's coming in the next verse. So we'll do the next verse and we'll quickly move on. Okay, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. بئس ما اشتروا به أنفسهم أن يكفروا بما أنزل الله بغيا أن ينزل الله من فضله على من يشاء من عباده فباءوا بغضب على غضب وَلِلْكَافِرِينَ عَذَابٌ مُهِينٌ. So the next step is they've recognized the message, they've understood it, they've chosen to ignore it, and Allah gives us a metaphor here, saying they've done a deal. They've done a deal. They've sold their souls just to stick to their own interpretation of their opinions. Yeah, based on how bad, how evil is the bargain. They've sold their souls, that they've rejected what God has revealed. Why? Baghyan. Yeah. Baghyan is out of jealousy, out of hatred. I just don't like that person. They're from a different group. So not based upon truth, but based upon jealousy or negative emotions. Baghyan bainahum. And that God has revealed His favour on somebody else. Okay. And then it said they aimed wrath upon wrath. And for the disbelievers, there is a humiliating punishment. Okay, let's pick up a couple of things from this verse. Okay. So first of all, God is saying that because of their choice, they've made a deal. They've chosen to sell their souls. They know not following the true guidance will lead to bad consequences in the Akhirah. They've sold their souls. Why? Because they've rejected what God has revealed. Why do they do that? And what they say is that we will follow what has been revealed to us. And this was the argument. Actually, we are following what God has revealed. What God has revealed to us, we're following that. We're not following what has come to you, but we are following what God has revealed to us. And in their mind, this was the logic. And if you think about it, this is exactly the same logic that all the sectarian people apply. Right? I'm not going to listen to what you're saying, even though you could give me the evidences. But no, we're following what our scholars, our tradition has said, and we are following God's law. What you're saying, we're not following that. But we are following what comes from our line and nobody else's. And this was their argument, this was their kind of reasoning. And as a result of this, why? It was jealousy and hatred. Why can God send a messenger to another group of people, whereas we are the most pious? Now go back to the story I told you in the beginning. So the wise man leaves this piece of paper with a group of people, and those group of people are guardians of that message. And then their children, they create a whole class of people. Now they feel now that they are the experts on religion. Nobody else can understand religion or interpret as they can. Anybody who does so, we're going to reject that, because we are the experts in religion. And based upon this, that's what they did. And God condemns this in the most strongest of terms. They learned anger upon anger. The anger of God is a mighty and powerful thing. And the consequences of this anger are that in this life you will be humiliated. Adhabun muhin. This is a divine law. If you reject the message of God and you choose to follow your own opinions, you will live in humiliation. And if you look around today, the Muslims are humiliated. And why is that? Why is that? And it fits in with these verses. We are claiming we've got God's message, but actually what we are really following is our own interpretation, our own opinions. What we should be doing is creating a criteria, saying, okay, this is the criteria that the Prophet ﷺ brought. Anything that agrees with this, no matter who says it, anything that agrees with this we accept. Everything else